Oh, heading up to 20 minutes after 7 o'clock. If you just walked in, good evening. I'm Gareth Edwards. Stage 6 blackouts in place, and not just, I'm afraid, till tomorrow morning. In fact, it's going to be in place for today, tomorrow, Saturday and Sunday. So it's going to be into the weekend, I'm afraid. We'll bring you the details later when we get a moment. The annual Transport Evolution Africa Forum and Expo is set to take place in September. Now, this is the 11th forum where local and international public and private stakeholders meet and plan the development and maintenance of our ports in Africa. Not just ports, also rail and road infrastructure. You can imagine the benefits for Africa if improved transport and logistics were actually in place. Not even to mention the vision of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Let's unpack this a little bit more. It's a huge pleasure to welcome Christian Kingombe from Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, making time for me this evening. Christian, hello to you. And this is the 11th summit of this as well. Give me a sense, how much have you actually achieved in reaching your goals, especially the SADC region for South Africa? Good evening.
Yes, good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me, and greetings from Durban, from Cape Town. So first of all, let me start by saying that a new agreement creating Africa's first continent-wide free trade area would generate great economic benefits. As a matter of fact, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, if fully implemented, could raise income by as much as 9% by 2035 and lift 50 million people out of extreme poverty. Lifting people out of poverty and into the middle classes basically means that sustainable development goals should be perceived as a business and investment opportunity, as discussed in today's Africa Impact Summit here in the Conference Center in Cape Town. So to realize its potential benefits, the agreement must accomplish its most ambitious goals, which include harmonization of policies on e-commerce, investment, intellectual property, but also transport and logistics. And this will be discussed in the forthcoming 11th Annual Transport Evolution Africa Forum, which will take place in September in Durban.
If you had to try and explain this to someone like myself who doesn't live and work in the logistics industry, whether it's freight, whether it's rail, whether it's road, in Africa, Southern Africa, here in South Africa, if you want to go that exact, what's the most important form of transport? What's the one that we really, really rely on the most, in your opinion?
If you look at the big so-called Program for Infrastructure Development, the so-called PIDA Trans-Africa corridors, you'll find that a large majority of freight are still being carried on roads by trucks, and not enough, I would say, is being carried on some of the other transport modes, which is inland waterways, or it can be airlines. The majority of the transport still happens on the major highways and roads in Africa.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you bring that up as well, because, and the importance of airlines, because here's two issues I'm sure that you know about here in South Africa. Sadly, more recently, is the attacks on the trucking sector in our country. Does that get brought up at a summit like this? Because that's got to be a concern for the region. It's got to be a concern for our neighbors as well. What do you make of what is happening with the trucking industry and the attacks there? And also, we've lost a number of airlines in South Africa. Just how well are we doing as a country in this summit and in these discussions?
Yeah, well, I cannot speak specifically to South Africa because I'm not South African, but I've recently been working on a big project within the Global Gateway, which is funded by the European Union, looking at some of the great transport corridors in the Horn of Africa, all the way from Cairo to Kampala, Sangani to Mombasa, and so on. So one of the things that we are suggesting in our report as recommendations to be funded by the European Union is to create roadside stations where the truckers, they can sleep safe at night, they can get their shower, they can eat their food and really feel safe. This is something that is missing on most of the major transport corridors, as we see in many parts of Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great idea as well to be able to try and create those little networks, those transport nodes, I think is the word I heard a couple of years ago. I always thought that tickled me. Transport nodes was quite a fun thing to say. I'm curious as well, so if you're talking European Union, let's expand global then. I just wanted to get your thoughts earlier on the trucks and airlines in our country. So where do we play on the international space. How are we viewed as a region, as a country perhaps, when it comes to the European Union, to trade there, to air transport and logistics there? How do we fare as a country? How do we fare as a continent, as a region?
Yeah, again, if I may come back to this project that falls within, or the program within the Global Gateway, which is a great new initiative that's coming out of the European Union, allocating more than $300 billion, not only to transport and logistics, but also to a number of other programs. The whole idea of this program is actually to have increased connectivity between the European Union and the African continent, but at the same time also lending support to the ongoing integration process on the African continent, being spearheaded by the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretariat. So at the moment, there are 3 protocols that are being discussed, and I'm working specifically within trade in services, where we are in the process of developing specialized training events on regulatory frameworks in 5 priority service sectors that has been selected by the African Union as a starting point for these negotiations.
Yeah. Okay. So if we translate that, just as I say goodbye to you, Christian, as well. So it sounds like you're working on a very large continental, almost global scale. So everything you just explained to me now, and the progress and the plans and the hopes of this, what do we as South Africa take away from this? What's our hope? What do we as South Africans look forward to in something like this? Last question to you.
Well, I mean, the whole purpose of the negotiations is to create a continental free trade area. This will be the biggest free trade area in the world. You have more than 1.3 billion inhabitants and consumers. So bringing down the trade barriers, improving the connectivity between the countries will eventually, with the right policies and regulatory frameworks in place, being harmonized, lead to increased benefits such as, of course, job creation, poverty reduction, increased cross-border trade, and at the end of the day, increased wealth and prosperity that we all like to see, particularly in South Africa, where you have very high unemployment rates.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't think anybody in this country would be disagreeing with you, and wishing you well for everything that you're planning on doing. Hope we talk again when there's some more plans in place, but it is the 11th edition of the summit. So Christian Kingombe, I appreciate your time this evening talking to us about what is happening at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's an ongoing discussion. As you can hear, we're into year 11 at the moment as well. It's the annual Transport Evolution Africa Forum. It's quite a title. It's going to be taking place in September as well. So this is part of the planning, part of the discussion ahead of that. I'm sure we'll get more details later in the year. My thanks to Christian this evening.